The fluorescent lights of the oubliette's solitary confinement block 4 flickered once, twice, then held, the way a condemned man holds his breath. Every eye in the cell block turned toward cell 4 to 7, though most guards quickly found somewhere else to look. Seo Corain sat on the concrete floor, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed, the posture of a man who had already buried himself. His orange jumpsuit, once pristine in the memory of men who feared his name, hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds to grief and concrete. His hair fell in dark, unkempt curtains over his forehead. He looked, to anyone watching, like a man who had already accepted the verdict the walls had handed him, but his hands were perfectly still, the stillness of a king who hadn't forgotten he was one. On the floor beside his boot lay the sharpened toothbrush, snapped clean in half now, its purpose served. The body of the new transfer inmate had been removed 40 minutes ago. The blood on Corain's sleeve had already dried to a rust-brown crust. He hadn't bothered to wipe it. Park Min-jae sent another one. That made 4 this month. 4 men, each one wearing a stranger's face, each one carrying the same quiet death sentence in their eyes. Corain had read them all before they reached him. You learn to read that look when you've spent 20 years being the one who sends the order. The weight of the block was suffocating, not from danger, but from irony. He had built the CO syndicate on one foundation above all others. Not money, not fear, not territory. Loyalty. He had given Min-jae everything. A name, a seat, a future. He had put the gun in his brother's hand during the early years when that hand was shaking. He had called him family when Min-jae had no one. And Min-jae had taken all of it, the name, the seat, the future, and handed Corain a prison cell in return. The heavy steel door at the end of the corridor groaned open. High heels, measured, unhurried. Every inmate within earshot went silent. Warden Ellen Scott walked the length of Block 4 the way she walked every hallway of the oubliette, like the building existed to accommodate her presence, not the other way around. The oubliette had no use for institutional distance. It was a black site in everything but name off every official registry, staffed lean, and answerable to no oversight body that anyone had successfully identified. Here, the warden was not an administrator behind glass. She was the building's only functioning authority, and she moved accordingly. Her light blue uniform was immaculate, rank patches crisp on each shoulder, her dark hair pulled back in a tight, professional knot. She carried nothing except a manila folder tucked under one arm and the kind of expression that had never once needed to raise its voice to command a room. She stopped at cell 4 to 7. She looked at the dried blood. She looked at the broken toothbrush. She looked at Corain. She did not flinch. The 2 guards flanking her exchanged a glance. She dismissed them with 2 words, an emotion so slight it barely qualified as a gesture. They left. The door at the end of the corridor sealed shut behind them with a pressurized hiss. Now it was just the 2 of them, separated by steel bars, the smell of copper in the air between them. Ellen crouched down slowly, until her eyes were level with his. She placed the manila folder flat on the concrete and slid it under the bars with 1 finger. Corain didn't move. He read the top page from where he sat. Asset liquidation orders. Every account, every holding, every shell company bearing a ghost of his name dissolved, absorbed, erased. Beneath that, a second document. An internal transfer request for Warden Ellen Scott, signed by 3 officials she had never petitioned. Effective in 72 hours. Reason: security concern. At the bottom of the stack, a surveillance photograph. Ellen Scott, taken outside her apartment building. Time-stamped 2 days ago. Min-jae wasn't just buying the prison anymore. He was buying her silence, or paying for it the permanent way. The silence between them stretched until it had weight. Then, Ellen Scott leaned forward, close enough that her voice wouldn't carry past the bars, and said the 7 words that changed everything. So why are you letting a jester sit on your throne? Corain's eyes finally moved. Slow, deliberate. They rose from the folder and found hers and something behind them, something that had gone dark and dormant for months in that 6x8 cell, shifted. Not rage, not grief, calculation. She held his gaze without flinching. Her expression wasn't sympathy. It wasn't pity. It was the look of someone who had already run the numbers, already decided, and was simply waiting for the other variable to agree. "I have 72 hours before they transfer me out of this facility," she said quietly. "And you have less than that before the next man they send gets luckier than the last 4. She straightened. "The man who destroyed both of us is throwing a victory gala before the year is out. I have the clearance codes to his security contracts. You have the contacts to make them worthless." She tilted her head, the city lights from the single high window catching the hard line of her jaw. "Get up, C.O. Corain. We have work to do." For a long moment, the only sound in Block 4 was the distant hum of the prison ventilation system, the mechanical breath of a place designed to make men disappear. Then Corain placed both palms flat on the floor and rose. The orange jumpsuit, the dried blood, the concrete dust on his knees, none of it touched the way he stood. The king had heard his queen's opening move. The game, the real game, had just begun. Before we start, go ahead and follow this channel and share this story with someone who loves a good revenge arc. Your city needs to see this one. It truly means a lot to me seeing this community grow from one corner of the world to the next. Every share, every comment, every new face helps us build something worth staying for together. The memory came back the way they always do, not all at once, but in fragments, shards of a life that had been whole 6 months ago, before the world rearranged itself around a single act of betrayal. It had been a Tuesday. Corain remembered that specifically because Min Jae had called him on a Monday night, his voice carrying that familiar warmth, the kind that had been there since they were 17 years old, running errands for a man neither of them respected, learning the city's underside the way other boys learned mathematics. "Brother," Min Jae had said, "the Busan shipment moved early. We need you at the Mappo warehouse by dawn. I can't be there, the council meeting runs long. You know how Chairman Lim gets." And Corain, because he had never once in 23 years had reason to question that voice, had said yes. He arrived at the Mappo warehouse at 4:47 inches the morning, alone. He always worked certain things alone. It was a discipline he'd maintained since the beginning, a way of keeping the cleanest hands possible at the top of an organization that required dirty ones below. The warehouse looked right. The contact standing at the loading dock looked right. Even the crates looked right. It was the silence that was wrong. He noticed it 3 seconds before the doors blew open, that specific quality of held breath that fills a space when 40 men are waiting in the dark, trying not to exist. By then, the contact had dropped flat, and the red laser sights were already painting him from every angle. And Detective Inspector Yoon Chae-won was stepping forward with handcuffs and an expression that suggested he had been looking forward to this moment for a very long time. What followed was a choreography so precise it could only have been rehearsed for weeks. The drugs were already in the warehouse, 200 kilos of product wrapped in CO syndicate packaging, a detail that shouldn't have been possible because Corain had personally abolished the use of identifiable syndicate markings 3 years prior. His fingerprints were on the wrapping. He would learn this later, in a holding cell, with the slow, dawning comprehension of a man watching a building fall in slow motion, understanding too late that the foundation was already gone. Then came the moment that sealed everything. Detective Yoon had turned to give an order to the officer behind him. The shot came from somewhere in the warehouse rafters, a single, clean report, and Yoon dropped without a sound. In the chaos that followed, the ballistic report would conclude that the bullet matched a custom pistol registered to CO Corain, a pistol that had been in his personal safe for 2 years and that he had not carried that morning. He had not needed to carry it. He had been walking into a meeting with his brother. The safe, forensics would later determine, showed no signs of forced entry. Only one other person had the combination. Corain sat in the courtroom 16 weeks later in a suit that no longer fit the man wearing it, not because of the weight he'd lost in remand, but because the man who had chosen that suit believed in something the courtroom had already decided didn't exist. The prosecution's case was airtight. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were consistent. His own legal team looked at him with the carefully maintained neutrality of people who had already privately reached a verdict. Min Jae sat in the gallery on the 3rd day of proceedings, in a charcoal suit, his expression appropriately somber. He caught Corain's eye once. He didn't look away. He held it steady, unreadable, with the patience of a man who had been planning this particular moment for long enough that he had already moved past needing to feel anything about it. That was when Corain understood completely. Not the betrayal, he had understood the shape of that in the warehouse. What he understood now, sitting in a mahogany-paneled room while a judge read a sentence that amounted to a quiet burial, was that Min Jae had not acted out of desperation or ambition, or even greed in the ordinary sense. He had acted out of something colder, something that had been sitting beneath 23 years of brotherhood like a fault line, patient and invisible, waiting for the geology to shift. Life without the possibility of parole. The gavel came down. Min Jae was already gone from the gallery. Corain noticed the empty seat before he noticed the sound. The interrogation room at the Oubliette was not designed for interrogations in any conventional sense. It was a 10 by 10 concrete box with a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a single overhead light that hummed at a frequency calibrated to erode patience, and a one-way mirror that everyone on both sides of it understood was decorative. There were no cameras inside a detail that Corain had noted on his 3rd day in the facility and filed away with the methodical precision of a man who catalogued environments the way other men breathed. Warden Ellen Scott arrived 12 minutes after the guard deposited him in the chair. She carried a legal pad, a pen, and 2 paper cups of coffee, one of which she set in front of him without asking if he wanted it. She sat across from him, uncapped the pen, looked at the legal pad, and then looked at him instead. "I've read your file," she said. Not as an introduction, as a statement of position. Corain wrapped both hands around the paper cup and said nothing. "Not the prosecution's file," she clarified. "Yours. The one that exists before lawyers get involved, the investigative record, the chain of custody documentation, the forensics intake logs." She tapped the pen against the pad once. "Detective Inspector Yoon Chae-won, the officer who died at the Mapo warehouse. You know what's interesting about him?" Corain looked at her. "He was supposed to retire in 4 months. She turned the legal pad around. She had written a single figure on it, a number with 8 digits. That's what landed in an account registered to his brother-in-law in Jeju 11 days before the Mapo operation. A brother-in-law who, as of the day before the operation, had no traceable income and a significant amount of personal debt." She pulled the pad back. "Yoon wasn't there to arrest you, Mr. Seo. He was there to be seen arresting you. The bullet that killed him was always part of the plan. Dead witnesses don't testify about who wrote the playbook." The hum of the overhead light filled the silence between them. "The question that keeps me up at night," Ellen continued, her voice carrying none of the theatricality. "The statement might have implied," she said it. "The way someone states a weather observation is how the ballistic match on your registered firearm holds up when the safe it was, supposedly stored in, has a digital access log." She let that sit. That log was never entered into evidence. It was flagged as non-essential by the lead investigator, a man who transferred to a significantly better resourced precinct 3 weeks after your conviction. Corain set the cup down. He had not yet touched the coffee. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. His voice was unhurried. It was the first time he had spoken at length to anyone since entering the Oubliette, and it landed in the room with the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades making sure that when he spoke, the words carried. Ellen Scott looked at him for a moment without answering, not because she didn't have one, but because she was deciding how much of the truth to put on the table at once. He could see the calculation behind her eyes. He recognized it. He'd used it himself in rooms not entirely unlike this one. "Because 3 weeks ago," she said finally, "I submitted a records request to the Seoul Central Prosecutor's Office flagging the access log discrepancy." She picked up the pen. "Put it down. Last week I received a very polite response informing me that the records in question had been misfiled and were no longer retrievable." A pause. "This morning, I found out that 2 of my senior staff members have been quietly reassigned to facilities in other districts, pending what is officially described as a routine administrative restructuring." She met his eyes directly. "Whoever buried you has a very long arm, Mr. Seo. And it appears that arm has recently become interested in this facility." The fluorescent light hummed. Corain picked up the coffee and drank. "You said I had a choice," he said. "In the cell block, You said die in here or help you expose the corruption. He set the cup down. That's not a choice. That's two versions of the same ending with different timelines. He studied her face the way he had studied faces for 20 years, looking not for what they showed, but for what they worked to hide. What do you actually want, Warden Scott? The question sat in the air between them. Ellen looked at the one-way mirror, then back at him. I want the name of every person Minjae has put inside this facility, she said. I want to know which guards, which staff, which administrative contacts. I want the full map of how his reach operates inside these walls. She held his gaze. In return, I give you every piece of evidence I've been quietly collecting for the past 3 months. I give you access to communication channels that don't exist on any log this facility maintains, and I keep you alive long enough to use both. A beat. We don't have to trust each other. We just have to be useful to each other. Corain was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Officer Bae Sung-ho, C Block day shift. He reports every Thursday. He watched her write it down. Guard Supervisor Im Tae-yang. He controls the blind spots in the camera rotation on blocks 3 and 4. Reports on an irregular schedule I'd estimate twice weekly. Another pause. The duty nurse on the medical wing. I don't know her name yet. But she's the one who adjusts the medication manifests when a hit is being staged as a medical incident. Ellen's pen moved steadily. You've been watching them, she said. It was not quite a question. I've been in a cell, Corain said. I had time. The new transfer arrived on a Thursday. A broad-shouldered man in his mid-30s, with a shaved head and a record that described a series of assault convictions across 3 provinces. His name, according to the intake paperwork, was Han Dong-soo. He had the look of a man who had done legitimate time, the particular economy of movement, the calibrated blankness that real inmates develop over years. He was convincing. He was also not Han Dong-soo. Corain made him in 48 hours. It wasn't any single thing. It was the aggregate, the way his eyes tracked the guard's rotation pattern with professional efficiency rather than instinctive survival awareness. The way he ate in the cafeteria with his back always to a wall, which was correct prison behavior, but positioned himself at an angle that maintained sightlines to Corain rather than to the room's general threat landscape. The way he had arrived with no known contacts in the facility, no established prison affiliation, no debts or history that would have generated either protection or enemies. A social vacuum that in a real inmate population was simply not possible. Corain said nothing. He moved through the next 36 hours the same way he moved through everything in the oubliette, with the measured patience of a man who understood that in a confined environment, timing was the only weapon that couldn't be confiscated. The showers on Block 4 ran between 0615 and 0645. The camera covering the northeast corner had a 4-second rotation gap that guard supervisor Im Tae-yang maintained. Corain had mapped it in his 3rd week. The man who called himself Han Dong-soo took his position in that corner on the 5th morning of his tenure in the block, and Corain watched him do it from the entrance and understood that the next 4 seconds were the ones that had been purchased for him. He turned to leave. The thing that saved him was not speed. It was the sound, the specific soft scrape of rubber on wet concrete that telegraphed a lunge a fraction of a second before it happened. He turned into it rather than away, which meant the blade opened a line across his forearm instead of finding his kidney, and then they were in contact, and Corain was operating on something older and more reliable than thought. It lasted 11 seconds. When it was over, the man who was not Han Dong-soo was on the floor and Corain was standing with the shiv in his hand and blood running down his wrist in a thin, steady line, and from somewhere to his left, there was the sound of something small and metal sliding across wet tile. He looked down. A folding blade. Compact. The kind issued to tactical response units. He looked up. The shower block entrance was empty. The door at the far end was still settling on its hinges, swinging closed with the casual momentum of something that had just been let go. He pocketed the blade. The warden, it turned out, had a very specific idea of what counted as non-intervention. In the infirmary, 20 minutes later, a surface laceration, 6 stitches. The duty nurse, who he now knew was named Choi, and who documented the injury as a self-inflicted accident while handling contraband. Corain pressed the back of his hand against the paper towel the nurse had given him and thought about the sound of high heels on a wet concrete floor. The warden had been in that corridor. She hadn't called the guards. She hadn't intervened visibly. She had simply ensured that when the moment came, he was not entirely without options, and then removed herself from the equation with the clean efficiency of someone who understood that deniability was its own form of protection. He thought about what that cost her. The risk calculus of a senior corrections official carrying contraband tactical equipment into a prison shower block at 0620 on a Thursday morning. If it had been discovered, if anyone had seen it, would have ended her career, her freedom, and very likely her life, given who was watching this facility. She had done it anyway. He filed that information with the same methodical care he filed everything, but something about it sat differently than intelligence usually did. It had a different weight. Surviving alone was something he had done before the toothbrush in Block 4 had proven that. But someone choosing to arm him, risking everything to ensure he was not entirely without options, was a different category of thing entirely. Survival by his own hand was expected. This was a choice someone made on his behalf. He had not had one of those in a very long time. The first encrypted message left the oubliette on a Monday. Ellen had sourced the phone through a supply chain so deliberately obscured that Corain, when she explained it to him in fragments over 3 separate conversations, found himself genuinely impressed. It was not a smuggled device in the conventional sense, no physical contraband crossing a checkpoint, no compromised guard carrying something in a boot or a lunch container. It was a maintenance contractor's secondary device, registered to a legitimate equipment inventory account, which happened to be logged as stored in a supply closet on Block 4's administrative corridor that happened to fall outside the camera coverage that Im Tae-young had been so carefully managing. The phone existed, on paper, as a backup communication device for facility infrastructure emergencies. It had a usage log that Ellen personally reviewed and, when necessary, edited. It had never, according to any record that could be audited, been used for anything other than its stated purpose. She passed Corain the access details in the margin of a disciplinary review form, written in a notation system that looked like administrative shorthand and would read as such to anyone without the key. He memorized it in 40 seconds and left the form in the return pile without marking it. The first message he sent was to a man named Cha Beom-seok, who ran a logistics operation out of Incheon and who had been loyal to the CO syndicate for 11 years, specifically because Corain had once, quietly and without making a point of it, ensured that a debt Cha couldn't pay didn't become a problem Cha couldn't survive. The message was 4 lines. It contained no names, no locations, no explicit instructions. To anyone reading it without context, it was a mundane business communication about shipping schedules. Cha Beom-seok read it in his office in Incheon and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he made 3 phone calls. Meanwhile, Ellen began her own work with a precision that Corain found, over the following weeks, increasingly difficult to attribute to anything as simple as professional competence. She was thorough in the way that people are thorough when they have a personal stake in the outcome, not just doing the job correctly, but ensuring that every action was positioned so that if it were ever examined, it would be found not only defensible but unremarkable. Officer Bae Sung-ho, C Block's Thursday reporter, was transferred to a coastal facility in South Jeolla Province within 10 days of their conversation in the interrogation room. The transfer documentation cited a routine personnel rotation and a staffing need at the receiving facility. It was signed by 3 different administrators across 2 departments, each of whom had separately received paperwork that made the request appear to originate from the others. None of them had reason to question it. Guard Supervisor Im Tae-yang lasted 2 weeks longer. His removal required more architecture, a formal performance review process, a documented pattern of minor procedural violations that Ellen had been quietly accumulating for 6 weeks before Corain had ever named him, and a union consultation that resolved in Im's reassignment rather than termination, which was intentional. Termination created grievances. Reassignment created distance. The duty nurse, Choi, was handled differently. Ellen didn't move her. She moved around her, restructuring the medical wing's documentation protocols in a way that was framed as a facility-wide efficiency initiative, which meant that any adjustments to medication manifests now required a co-signature from a second staff member. Choi could not be touched without creating evidence of the reason for touching her. So, instead, Ellen built a system around her that made her useful to Min Jae's operation no longer possible. Each of these actions was invisible on its own. Together, they were the systematic dismantling of an intelligence network that had been embedded in the oubliette long enough to believe itself permanent. Corain watched it happen from Block 4, with the focused attention of a general watching a campaign unfold on a map. Ellen reported to him in the interrogation room twice weekly, under the documented cover of ongoing behavioral assessments legitimate enough in format that no one questioned them, routine enough in frequency that no one tracked them. She brought him information. He gave her context. The conversation moved in both directions with the efficiency of two people who had, without formally deciding to, begun operating as a single unit. He noticed things about her in those sessions that he filed and did not immediately do anything with. The way she organized information chronologically by default, but restructured spatially when she was thinking through a problem, so that her notes would shift from lists to diagrams mid-conversation without her seeming to notice. The way she held eye contact during difficult disclosures but looked slightly to the left when she was working through something she hadn't fully resolved yet. The fact that she took her coffee without anything in it and always let it go cold before she finished it, because she was never not thinking about something else. He did not examine why he was filing these particular observations. On the 31st day of their arrangement, Corain made a phone call that lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds and rerouted through 6 different relay points before reaching its destination. The man on the other end was named Jeon Hyuk, and he managed a mid-tier investment portfolio that, to the Seoul Financial Exchange, appeared to be a legitimate asset management firm, specializing in logistics and infrastructure. To anyone with the right knowledge, the firm was the financial nervous system through which the CO syndicate had moved and cleaned its operational capital for 8 years. Min Jae had assumed control of the firm 48 hours after Corain's conviction. He had restructured its board, replaced its operational contacts, and renamed 3 of its shell subsidiaries. Careful, thorough work that demonstrated he understood the asset he'd acquired. What he had not accounted for was Jeon Hyuk. Jeon Hyuk had been loyal to Corain specifically because Corain had spent 8 years treating him not as an instrument, but as a professional, consulting him, respecting his judgments, protecting his autonomy. Min Jae, in his first week of control, had called Jeon Hyuk at 11 p.m. and referred to him as an accountant. The 4-minute call was enough. Over the next 72 hours, Jeon Hyuk executed a series of trades that were, individually, each within the normal operational parameters of the portfolio, and therefore auditable without concern. Collectively, they redistributed a significant portion of the firm's liquid capital into positions that Min Jae's new board could see, but not access holdings structured through instruments that required authorization signatures. Min Jae didn't possess, from subsidiary officers who had, as of the previous week, quietly indicated their loyalty in a different direction. Min Jae's financial team noticed on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, 3 shipments that should have cleared Busan port had been held by customs agents who had received, through entirely legitimate channels, updated documentation requests from a regulatory office they couldn't trace. By Thursday, 2 of Min Jae's senior lieutenants had reported to him independently that their operational accounts were showing irregularities. By Friday, a 4th shipment, this one moving through Incheon, through Cha Beom-seok's logistics network, simply did not arrive. The trucks existed in the tracking system. The cargo had been logged at origin. Somewhere between departure and destination, it had ceased to exist. Corain was in his cell on Friday evening when Ellen passed a folded note through the standard documentation exchange of his weekly administrative review. He read it in 4 seconds and committed it to memory. He's moved 2 council meetings this week, changed 3 phone numbers, rotated his personal security detail. He's looking for a leak in his operation. He doesn't know the leak is a ghost. Corain set the paper in the standard return pile. He looked at the wall of his cell, 6 feet of concrete with a hairline crack running from the upper left corner to approximately the midpoint of the right edge. A crack he had memorized weeks ago, and now barely saw. Min Jae was panicking. Good. A panicking man makes decisions from the wrong place, from fear rather than strategy, from the urgent rather than the important. He tightens where he should loosen. He trusts fewer people, which means he over-relies on the ones he trusts, which means those people become load-bearing in ways they were never designed to be. He starts seeing ghosts in his own organization, and in doing so, he creates fractures in it. Karain had built the CO syndicate on the understanding that control was not about power, it was about information. He who knew the most, knew it first, and knew how to move through it without creating a wake, was the one who held the room, regardless of what the room thought of itself. He was in a 6x8 cell. He had a phone that didn't officially exist, a warden who moved like a precision instrument through the bureaucratic architecture of his captivity, and a lifetime's worth of accumulated relationships that Min Jae had tried to inherit but couldn't, because loyalty of that depth wasn't a thing you could acquire with a hostile takeover. It was a thing you built over 20 years of Tuesday phone calls and midnight decisions, and understanding that the people around you were not assets. They were people. He thought of Min Jae in his charcoal suit, sitting in the gallery, holding his gaze across a courtroom. He thought of the gavel. Then he closed his eyes and began composing the next message in his head, running through the relay points, calibrating the language, thinking 3 moves ahead the way he had always thought, in the language of someone who understood that the game was never over until the board was flipped, and even then, the pieces were still on the floor, waiting to be picked up by someone patient enough to find them. The overhead light hummed. Seo Karain, in his orange jumpsuit with the rust-brown stain on the sleeve that the laundry had never quite managed to remove, sat on his concrete floor with his back against the wall and his eyes closed, and his hands completely still. He was no longer hollow. He was building. And somewhere on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the Gangnam district, in an office that had once belonged to a man who trusted him, Park Min Jae was staring at a financial report he couldn't explain and feeling for the first time since a courtroom gavel came down 6 months ago, the specific chill of a man who has made a catastrophic miscalculation and is only now beginning to understand its dimensions. He was also, in those same weeks, doing something quieter, mapping the Block 4 population the way he had always mapped rooms, looking not for threats, but for weight-bearing walls. Men who had something to lose and something to gain, and enough self-possession to tell the difference between the two. He had identified 3. One of them was a man named Ryu Sang-cheol, 14 years in, who moved through the block with the contained patience of someone who had stopped being angry about his sentence and started being deliberate about what came after it. Karain had done nothing dramatic. A word here. A resolved tension there. The kind of attention that costs nothing to give and that men in confined spaces remember for a very long time. He just didn't know yet what shape it was taking, or where it was coming from, or that it was already too late to stop it. It happened on a Wednesday evening, in the interrogation room, 43 days into their arrangement. Ellen arrived 7 minutes later than their established window, not enough to trigger concern under normal circumstances. But Karain had been precise enough in his observation of her patterns to know that she did not run late. She was constitutionally incapable of it. Punctuality, for Ellen Scott, was not a discipline. It was a baseline. The 7 minutes meant something had happened before she walked through the door, and whatever it was, she had spent those 7 minutes deciding what to do with it. She sat down. She set her legal pad on the table. She did not open it. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, not the professional composure she wore like a second uniform, and not the focused intensity of their working sessions. Something quieter. Something that had been held under pressure for a long time and was only now, by conscious decision, being allowed to surface. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond." Karain said nothing. He waited. "My name is Ellen Scott," she said. "That part is real. But before Scott, it was Song. Ellen Song." She placed both hands flat on the legal pad, not as a gesture but as an anchor. "My father was Song Byung-il. He ran the song operation out of Busan for 18 years. Mid-tier syndicate, not your level, but established. Legitimate enough in the areas that mattered and careful enough in the ones that didn't. A pause. I think you know who he was. Corain was still. His expression did not change. He died just over 11 years ago, Ellen said. The official story was a rival territory dispute. A hit ordered by the Seo syndicate in retaliation for song encroachment on your Busan shipping routes. She met his eyes directly. That's what I was told. That's what I believed for 11 years. That's why I applied for the position at this facility when I saw your name on the incoming transfer manifest. She exhaled slowly. I took this job to kill you. The fluorescent light hummed between them. I want you to know, she said, that I am telling you this now not because I've decided you're innocent of everything. I'm not naive about what the CO syndicate was. I'm telling you because 3 weeks ago, I found something in your financial records that didn't fit the story I was given, and I have spent 3 weeks confirming it, and I owe you the truth of what I found. She opened the legal pad. She turned it to face him. It was a transaction record, not a financial one, but a personnel record. A payment authorization for a contracted operation, dated 11 years and 4 months ago. Routed through a shell entity, Corain recognized immediately as one of the CO syndicate's secondary operational accounts from that period. The authorization bore 2 signatures. One was his. Or rather, one appeared to be his, the same signature that had appeared on documents throughout his trial, a signature that forensic analysis had certified as authentic, and that Corain had known since the first day of his trial was not. The second signature was Park Min-jae's. Corain looked at it for a long time. The song operation was never a territorial threat, he said. His voice was level. Your father was careful. He stayed inside his lanes. I had no reason to move against him. He looked up from the page. I didn't order that hit. I know, Ellen said. Min-jae ran the Busan division independently for 8 months in 2013, Corain said. I gave him full operational authority while I was managing the transition after Chairman Lim's death. He had signature access to secondary accounts for that period. He looked at the authorization again. Your father's operation was adjacent to a supply route Min-jae was trying to consolidate. Song Byung-il would have been an obstacle. He was the kind of obstacle that could have been negotiated with, Ellen said. There was no heat in it. It was a statement of fact, delivered by someone who had spent 11 years carrying a grief that had just been reoriented without warning. My father was not a violent man. He was a businessman who happened to operate in a specific economy. He would have talked. Min-jae doesn't negotiate when he can eliminate, Corain said. He never did. I thought it was efficiency. I thought it was the pragmatism of someone who understood the cost of prolonged conflicts. He paused. I didn't understand that he was practicing. The word landed in the room, and neither of them moved. Ellen looked at the legal pad. He killed my father to clear a supply route and signed your name to it. She said it the way you say something you have been rehearsing in order to make it real. And then, 11 years later, he destroyed your life to clear the throne. She closed the pad. He has been doing this his entire career, using your name, your organization, your trust as instruments. And when the instrument became inconvenient, he put the instrument in a box, Corain said. Silence. Then Ellen said something he had not expected. She said, I'm sorry. And when he looked at her, he understood she did not mean it as an apology for her intent to kill him, though that was present too, underneath. She meant it the way people mean it when they are standing next to someone in the specific wreckage of a particular kind of loss, and the only honest thing available is acknowledgement. He had lost 23 years of brotherhood to a lie. She had lost her father to one. They had both been made into instruments of the same man's ambition without ever knowing it, separated by a decade and a fabricated story, sitting now in a 10 by 10 concrete room under fluorescent light. Corain said, He will pay for your father first, then for everything else. It was not a comfort. It was a contract. Ellen received it as such. When she left the interrogation room 40 minutes later, the thing between them had changed in a way that neither of them named, because naming it would have required acknowledging that what had begun as a cold strategic alliance had become something with weight and heat and the particular density of two people who had each, in their own way, been entirely alone for a very long time. The riot started on a Friday at 1140, which Corain later understood was deliberate. Friday midday was the facility's lowest staffing window shift change overlap, reduced administrative presence, the natural lull of an institution settling into the rhythm of a weekend. Someone had done their research. The first sign was the smell accelerant, thin but unmistakable, drifting from the direction of the laundry facility on Block 3. Then the alarms, layered and discordant, and then the sound that anyone who has ever been inside a prison during a riot recognizes before they consciously process it, the specific basal roar of several hundred confined men deciding, simultaneously, that the structure holding them has temporarily ceased to apply. Corain was already moving. He had known something was coming for 36 hours. Not the specifics, not the laundry facility, not the Friday timing, but the shape of it. Minjae's response to the financial disruptions had cycled through panic, then reorganization, then a period of ominous quiet that Corain recognized as the silence of someone who had decided to stop being subtle. 3 of the newly transferred guards on Block 4 had arrived in the past 2 weeks. Corain had not been able to confirm their affiliations with certainty, but their body language was wrong in the specific way that men are wrong when they are performing a role rather than inhabiting one. He had sent Ellen a single line through the documentation exchange the previous evening. 3 new guards. Block 4. Verify before Friday. She had not had time to verify all 3. The cell block unsealed during the emergency protocol standard procedure designed to prevent inmates from being trapped during a facility fire, a protocol that someone had clearly factored into their planning. Corain stepped into the corridor and immediately assessed. Approximately 60 men from Block 4 were mobile. The emergency lighting was painting everything in red-tinged shadows. And from somewhere in the direction of Block 3 there was the sound of genuine violence that was going to pull every legitimate guard in the facility toward it, which meant Block 4 was going to be very quiet and very unsupervised for the next several minutes. The 3 new guards appeared from the administrative corridor simultaneously, not the panicked convergence of officers responding to a crisis, but the coordinated emergence of men moving to assigned positions. They were not wearing their batons. They were carrying something else. The largest of the 3 was reaching for Corain when the first thing came over his shoulder. It was a fire extinguisher, swung in a flat arc by a man named Ryu Sang-cheol, who was serving 14 years for a string of armed robberies across 4 provinces, and who had, over the past 3 weeks, received 3 separate favors from Corain. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be documented, just the quiet redistribution of information and resources that Corain had spent 40 years learning to move without fingerprints. A warning about a pending shakedown. A debt resolution between Ryu and another inmate who had been creating problems. A word in the right ear that had resulted in Ryu's work assignment shifting from the laundry to the kitchen, which was, in the hierarchy of prison economics, a significant improvement. Ryu Sang-cheol swung the extinguisher because Seo Corain had treated him like a person. The guard went down. What followed in the next 4 minutes was not elegant. It was close, brutal, confined the kind of fighting that has nothing to do with training and everything to do with who is willing to commit fully and who is not. The 2 remaining men were capable, but they were operating in a corridor full of inmates who had made a collective, instantaneous decision, and that decision had a weight that 2 capable men could not hold against. Ellen arrived from the administrative corridor at the 2-minute mark, with her collapsible baton extended, and her expression carrying the focused calm of someone operating on the other side of adrenaline past the spike, into the clear, functional state where capable people do their best work under pressure. She moved with an economy that Corain registered even in the middle of everything, because he was constitutionally unable to stop cataloging how people moved in high-stress situations. She was not fighting frantically. She was solving a sequence of immediate problems with the minimum force required to resolve each one and move to the next. When it was over, the 3 men were restrained with their own equipment. The Block 4 corridor was intact. The riot on Block 3 continued for another 22 minutes, during which Ellen coordinated the facility's official response through her radio with one hand, while helping Corain secure the administrative corridor with the other. Afterward, in the specific stillness that follows violence, Corain stood in the corridor and looked at the 40-odd inmates who had stayed, rather than dispersed men who could have used the chaos to create problems of their own, or simply to disappear into the facility's disorder, but who had instead, by some collective gravity, remained in Block 4, remained adjacent to what had just happened, remained, if he was reading it correctly, in proximity to him. Ryu Sung-cheol was leaning against the wall with a split lip, arms crossed, watching him with the patient expression of a man who has made a decision and is waiting to see what the person he made it for is going to do with it. Corain looked at the corridor, at the men in it, at Ellen standing 6 feet away with blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers, her hair half escaped from its practical knot, her radio in one hand and her baton in the other. He said, at a volume that carried without projecting, "When we leave this place, every man standing in this corridor leaves with us. What comes after is your choice. But you will not be forgotten and you will not be abandoned." He paused. "That is a promise from a man who has only ever broken one, and he is the reason we are all standing in this corridor." No one spoke, but no one moved either. Which was, in its own language, an answer. Ellen spent 11 days building the exit. It was not a tunnel, and it was not a bribe, and it was not the kind of escape that left evidence of an escape. It was paperwork. Specifically, it was a medical transfer request for one high-security inmate presenting with symptoms consistent with a rare cardiac condition, requiring specialist intervention unavailable at the current facility, supported by a clinical assessment from the facility physician, a supporting consultation from an external specialist whose credentials were verifiable, and whose office operated by a man who had owed a debt to Cha Beom-seok for 6 years and had just been given the opportunity to clear it, would confirm the case if contacted. The transfer required authorization from 3 different administrative levels. Ellen had prepared the request so that each authorizing officer received documentation that appeared to originate from the level above them, making the approval feel like a formality rather than a decision. The facility's legal compliance officer, who reviewed all high-security transfers, received a supplementary briefing that framed the transfer as a liability mitigation measure. Should the inmate's condition deteriorate within the facility, the legal exposure would be significant. The compliance officer initialed the document within 4 hours. The transport paperwork listed 2 accompanying staff, a medical escort and a correctional supervisor. Both positions were filled by names drawn from the legitimate facility roster, both conveniently on scheduled leave during the transport window, their names borrowed from the system with the careful, temporary precision of a pickpocket who returns the wallet. On the morning of the transfer, 2 people arrived at the Block 4 intake corridor in the correct uniforms, carrying the correct documentation, moving with the correct professional indifference of people who did this routinely and found it unremarkable. One of them was Ellen Scott, whose face was known to every person in the facility, and who was, on this morning, wearing the administrative clearance that made her presence at a medical transfer unremarkable. The other was a man whose face was not known to anyone in the oubliette, because he had never been to the oubliette, and whose uniform had been sourced through a supply contact in Incheon. Im Tae-yang's reassignment 3 weeks prior had left the Block 4 camera administration without its previous custodian. Ellen had absorbed the oversight responsibility into her own portfolio the same day his transfer was processed, citing continuity of security protocols. No one had questioned it. No one questioned anything Ellen Scott framed as administrative continuity. The inmate brought to the intake corridor was Seo Corain, who had spent the previous evening doing nothing in particular in his cell, which would be confirmed by the camera footage showing a man in an orange jumpsuit lying on a prison cot, footage that Ellen had arranged to be supplemented with a loop of sufficient length to cover the morning window. The intake process took 9 minutes. They walked out the front door of the oubliette at 8, 23 inches the morning, in weak winter sunlight, Corain in a medical transport restraint that was locked with a key Ellen had transferred to his left palm during the corridor walk, and Ellen with her hand at his elbow in the guiding grip of a correctional supervisor managing a medical transfer, her face carrying the professional neutrality of a woman doing a routine job on a routine morning. The transport vehicle, a medical contractor's van, legitimate plate, legitimate registration, operated by another of Cha Beom-seok's network, pulled away from the facility entrance at 8:31. At 8:47, the van turned off the primary road and onto a secondary route. At 8:51, Karain removed the restraint. He sat for a moment with his wrists in his lap, looking at his hands, the hands of a man who had been in a cell for 4 months and who was now, for the first time, sitting in a moving vehicle, with the city's winter light coming through tinted glass and the oubliette receding in the distance behind him. Ellen was sitting across from him. She had removed her uniform jacket. Underneath it, she was wearing a plain, dark sweater that made her look like someone entirely different from the warden he had known through steel bars and fluorescent light. Her hair was still pulled back, but looser the morning's motion had let several strands escape, and she hadn't fixed them. She was watching him with an expression he had learned to read over 11 weeks of interrogation rooms and corridor conversations, and a riot that had lasted 4 minutes and changed the composition of everything. "How does it feel?" she said. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Unfinished," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "Good," she said. "We have a lot of work to do." The safe house was in Mapo, 3 blocks from the Han River, on the 4th floor of a building whose ground floor operated as a dry cleaning business that had been legitimate for 30 years, and that had, for the past 11 of those years, also operated as a quiet transit point for the kind of arrangements that required discretion and a loading bay with rear access. The apartment above it had been maintained by Cha Beom-seok's network for emergencies and had never been used for one until now. It had 3 rooms, adequate heat, and a closet that had been stocked in the previous 48 hours by people who had received specific measurements and specific requirements and who had not asked questions. Karain stood in front of the bathroom mirror for the first time in 4 months and looked at a face he recognized, but that seemed to require reacquaintance. The weight loss was visible in the jaw, in the sharpness of angles that had previously been softer. The stubble was significant. His hair, without the humidity of the prison block, had dried differently, hanging with a weight that made him look younger than he felt. He showered for a long time. Not from urgency, but from the particular luxury of standing under clean, hot water without a clock running, and without the background awareness of vulnerable positioning that had been a constant companion for 4 months. He stood in the steam and let it work on him, and did not think about anything specific, which was itself a kind of discipline. The suit was in a garment bag hanging from the closet door. Black, which was correct not because he had requested it, though he had, but because it was the only color that would do for what was coming. The fit was precise in the way that bespoke tailoring is precise, which meant that whoever Cha had sourced it from was working from accurate measurements. The shirt was white, the bow tie was black, the shoes had been polished to a finish that caught light. He dressed methodically, and with the deliberate attention of someone performing a ritual that mattered. Not vanity, nothing as simple as that. More the understanding that what he put on tonight was not clothing. It was a declaration. He was arriving at Park Min-jae's celebration of a stolen empire, and what he wore was going to be the first thing every person in that room understood before he said a single word. He was not the man who had been buried. He was the man who had come back from it. He stood in front of the mirror again and picked up the razor. In the next room, he could hear the particular quality of silence that means someone is engaged in a focused, private process of their own. He finished his preparation and sat on the edge of the bed and waited with the patience that 4 months in a cell teaches by necessity, and that a lifetime in his specific profession had already made instinct. When Ellen appeared in the doorway, he understood immediately why the silence had that quality. The emerald was deliberate, a color that existed at the precise intersection of power and femininity that made the room around her shift its orientation the way rooms do when something changes their central gravity. The dress moved with her rather than on her. Floor-length silk with a slit that spoke of capability rather than performance. Her hair was down and loose, falling in dark waves that caught the apartment's warm light and held it. The diamond drop earrings were small enough to be understated and bright enough to be noticed. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame and looked at him, looking at her, and said, with the directness that he had come to understand was her most essential quality. "Say it, and we move on," he said. "You look extraordinary." "Good," she said. "Now we move on." But her chin lifted slightly as she said it, and that, from Ellen Scott, was everything. He stood. She appraised him with the same directness, efficient and total, the assessment of someone who notices everything and assigns each thing its correct value. "The jaw helps," she said. "The dress is doing more work than the jaw." "The jaw is doing fine," she said. "Stop fishing." He almost smiled. They stood in the small apartment, the man in the tuxedo and the woman in the emerald gown, and between them was the wait of 11 weeks, and a riot, and a dead man's truth, and a walk out a front door in winter light. Everything they had not said to each other yet about what any of it meant. "The families will be there," Coraine said. 12 of the 14 major council seats. Min Jae has been courting them for months. He's presenting tonight as a consolidation gala, the official passing of authority from the Seo era to his. "Does he know we're coming?" "No. Does anyone?" "Ryu Sang-cheol knows the location and the window. He'll have the men positioned before we arrive." He paused. "They're not soldiers. They're inmates who made a decision in a corridor. They held that corridor for 4 minutes against trained men," Ellen said. "That's enough." She picked up the clutch from the bed, small, black, containing, Coraine had no doubt, something considerably more functional than its size suggested. "Min Jae will have his security detail, his personal guard, and whatever he's hired for the gala. We're walking in the front door." "We're walking in the front door," Coraine confirmed. She nodded once, the nod of a woman who has run the numbers and decided that the plan is the plan. "Then let's end this," she said. The Golden Summit occupied the entire top floor of a building in Gangnam that had once, in a previous life, been the venue where Coraine had hosted the Seo Syndicate's annual council gathering 3 years running. He knew its architecture the way he knew the safe house and the prison block, not from blueprints but from presence. He knew where the service corridors ran, where the emergency stairwells opened, where the positions in the rafters overlooked the main ballroom floor, and where, at the far end of the east corridor, a secondary access point had been installed 7 years ago at his specific request and never removed, because Coraine had always maintained the quiet discipline of knowing where his exits were. They arrived at 10:47 p.m. The gala was in full ceremony, the lights of the city visible through floor-to-ceiling glass, the room arranged with the specific opulence of a man who has acquired wealth suddenly and wants everyone to see it. Chandeliers. A live ensemble. 12 tables occupied by the council families and their representatives, dressed in the formal language of organized wealth. At the head of the room, at a raised platform designed to communicate hierarchy, Park Min-jae stood in a white suit, Coraine noted, which was either audacity or ignorance, and Min-jae had never been ignorant. He was raising a glass, beginning his toast. Coraine and Ellen were in the service corridor adjacent to the main staircase. Ellen looked at him. He looked at her. No words, they had covered the sequence in the van on the way, and both of them had the kind of memory that didn't require repetition. She moved first, toward the east corridor, and the positions she needed to clear before the staircase moment. He moved toward the staircase. He heard Min-jae's voice carrying from the ballroom the measured warmth of a practiced public speaker, the cadences of a man who understood that a room of this kind required theater as much as information. He was halfway through something about legacy and continuity and a new era. Then the lights went out. The emergency system brought them back in 4 seconds standard building protocol, standard duration, enough time for one thing to change. Seo Coraine stood at the top of the grand staircase. The room below him went silent in a way that had nothing to do with the lights. It was the silence of 300 people whose collective understanding of reality had just been revised without warning. He saw it move through the room like a wave, the recognition, the recalibration, the specific quality of shock that comes not from fear, but from the collision of what was known to be true and what is undeniably present. He was in a tuxedo. His hair was back, his jaw was clean. His hands were at his sides, and his expression carried the settled, absolute composure of a man who has been in rooms like this one 100 times, and has never once been the least important person in any of them. From Min Jae's platform, across the length of the ballroom, he watched his former brother go pale. Then Min Jae said something to the man on his right, a command, sharp and low, and the room began to reorganize itself toward violence. Nothing happened. The security detail stood where they were. They did not move toward Karain. They did not raise weapons. They stood with the specific stillness of men who have already received different instructions from a different authority. Instructions routed through clearance codes and operational accounts that Min Jae's IT team had not yet managed to lock, because Karain's access to his own systems had been restored 72 hours ago through a chain of actions that Jeon Hyuk had executed with the quiet precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. From the rafters, there was a single muffled sound. Then another. Ellen's marksmanship, it turned out, was not a figure of speech. The two snipers Min Jae had positioned in the overhead structure had been her first priority from the east corridor. She moved through the rafters in her emerald gown, and her flat-soled backup shoes she had changed in the van, heels in the clutch, functionality prioritized with the focused efficiency of someone for whom the dress was incidental and the objective was not. By the time the second sniper was neutralized, Karain was on the ballroom floor. What followed was not a clean operation. It was fast, loud, and close, the hired personal guard making decisions in real time without the support structure they had expected. The council families pressing back against the walls with the practiced self-preservation of people who have survived rooms like this before. The ensemble abandoning their instruments at a speed that suggested they had read the situation correctly, approximately 30 seconds ahead of most. Karain moved through it with the directness of a man who has one destination and has already cleared everything else from the calculation. He took a hit to the ribs from a guard who was larger than average and committed enough to be dangerous. Felt it, filed it, kept moving. He put two men down in the space between the second and third tables, and the third he redirected with the economical leverage of someone who learned to fight in environments where space was never adequate and excess motion was always a liability. Min Jae had moved toward the east exit. Karain was faster. They met in the corridor that led to the rooftop access, just the two of them. The noise of the ballroom behind them, the city's night visible through the stairwell windows. Soul spread below like a circuit board in the dark. Min Jae turned at the rooftop door because there was nowhere else to go. He looked at Karain, at the tuxedo, at the jaw, at the settled expression, and his face cycled through several things in quick succession. Shock, then calculation, then something that might have been, underneath everything else, recognition. The recognition of a man who had underestimated the depth of the thing he was dealing with and understood it only now. "You were in a cell," Min Jae said. "I was," Karain said. "You had nothing." "I had time," Karain said, "and a better partner than you ever gave me." Min Jae moved because men like Min Jae always move, even when the numbers are wrong, and it was over before it had fully begun. Karain was not angry. He had stopped being angry weeks ago, somewhere between the riot and the razor, and what had replaced it was something cleaner and more permanent. He put Min Jae on the ground with the minimum required, and stood over him and looked at him, at the white suit, no longer white, at the face that had held his gaze across a courtroom, at the man who had taken 23 years of brotherhood and used it as a demolition tool. Min Jae had worn white tonight to announce himself as something new. The rooftop concrete had an opinion about that. He held the gun to Min Jae's head. The city was very quiet from the rooftop. The wind off the Han was cold. Below them, through the stairwell, he could hear the sounds of a room reorganizing itself around a new understanding of who held authority. He stood there for a long moment. Then, he lowered the gun. "There's a cell at the oubliette," Karain said. "Block 4, cell 4 to 7, 6 by 8. The light flickers at night. The crack in the wall runs from the upper left corner." He looked at Min Jae. "You have time to count it." He stepped back. Ellen was in the doorway. She had appeared without sound, the way she moved through every space she occupied with the precise sufficiency of someone who was always exactly where she needed to be. Her hair was still down, one strap of the gown adjusted from the movement of the rafters, the clutch in her left hand with its specific weight. She looked at Min Jae on the ground. She looked at Karain. He said nothing. Neither did she. They had long since moved past requiring language for the things that mattered between them. Behind her, in the stairwell, he could hear footsteps Ryu Sang-cheol and the men from Block 4, who had held a corridor and been promised they would not be forgotten, appearing now at the threshold of a conclusion they had crossed a city to reach. And beyond them, down in the ballroom, the council families were waiting. Corain descended the staircase the second time differently than he had the first. The first time had been theater necessary, deliberate, designed to land with maximum impact on a room full of people who needed to have their understanding of the situation revised before anything else could happen. The second time was a conclusion. He walked into the ballroom and stood in the space that had cleared around the platform and looked at 12 tables of the most dangerous people in the city's shadow economy. And he spoke to them not as a ghost or a revelation, but as the man he had always been, in the register of someone who has never needed volume to command attention. He told them what Min-jae had done. Not in the language of grievance, he did not perform the betrayal for sympathy. He laid it out in the factual sequence of a man presenting an account that could be verified, supported by the financial documentation that Jeon-hyuk had been systematically assembling for weeks, documentation that would, in the morning, also find its way to 3 specific journalists, 2 prosecutors, and a regulatory office whose interest in Min-jae's consolidated holdings had been carefully cultivated by Ellen through channels that would survive any subsequent scrutiny. He told them about Song Byung-il. He told them because the families needed to understand that Min-jae's methodology was not new and had not been limited to the CO syndicate. He told them because some of the people at those 12 tables had fathers and predecessors who had done business with Song, and who deserved to understand the shape of what had actually happened to him. The room listened. When he was done, he said, "The CO syndicate returns to its operations under its legitimate leadership. What Min-jae built using CO resources is returned to CO authority. What he built using his own methods and other families' assets is a matter for those families to resolve." He paused. "Anyone who chooses to contest this in the coming weeks is welcome to. But they should understand clearly what it costs to contest me. And they should consider that the woman standing to my left has spent the past 3 months building a legal architecture around every operation in this room that she can activate or suspend at her discretion." The room looked at Ellen. Ellen looked back at the room with the expression of someone who has already had this conversation in her head and won it. No one contested. They left the Golden Summit at 1:22 inches the morning. The city was quiet in the way that cities are quiet at that hour, not empty, but internalized. The noise pulled inward, the streets carrying only the motion of people who have specific places to be in the dark. The Han River was a black ribbon to the south, catching the city's light in slow, indifferent movement. Ellen walked beside him in heels she had changed back into in the east corridor. In the 2 minutes between descending from the rafters and the second staircase entrance, she had been specific about needing those 2 minutes, and Corain had not asked why, because some things about Ellen Scott he had learned to simply accept as operational requirements. It was, he reflected, entirely consistent with who she was. Her hair moved in the winter wind. She had her clutch under her arm and her hands in the small pockets of the gown's hidden seam, which he had not noticed until now, and which made him wonder, briefly, what else about the dress was more functional than it appeared. They walked for half a block before either of them said anything. "The council will hold," she said. "Not a question. Long enough," he said. "The ones who were loyal to the institution rather than to Min-jae specifically will fall into line. The ones who were personally invested in him will need to be handled individually. That takes time." He paused. "I have time now." She made a sound that might have been agreement. "Another half a block. The legal architecture," he said. "You said you could activate or suspend it." "I said she could," Ellen said, referring to herself in the third person to a room full of criminals. "Standard intimidation technique. Can you?" A pause. "Selectively," she said, "and with significant personal risk." She looked at him sideways. "But yes." He nodded. "Then I have a question," he said. "You have several," she said. "You've been constructing them for weeks. I've watched you do it." He stopped walking. She stopped a step ahead and turned, which put them facing each other on a quiet Gangnam street at 1:24 inches the morning, her in emerald and him in black, the city's light, doing what the city's light had been doing all night, catching the edges of things and making them clear. "The job at the oubliette," he said. "You took it to kill me. You stayed to expose Min Jae." He looked at her. "What do you stay for now?" Ellen looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has already run this particular calculation, but is deciding, in real time, how much of the working to show. "I have a useful skill set," she said, "and a significant knowledge base regarding the operational structure of organized crime in this city." She paused. "It would be irresponsible to let that go to waste." "That's not an answer." "No," she said. "It's not." She looked at him for another moment. "Then, ask me again in 6 months, when we've both had time to become people rather than instruments." It was honest. It was exactly what she would say. It was also, he understood, its own kind of answer. He said, 6 months. She said, "Don't be dramatic about it." He almost smiled. She almost let him. They walked on, together, through a city that was already, in the hours before dawn, beginning to rearrange itself around a new configuration of power, not the configuration Min Jae had built, which had been founded on theft and fear and the leveraged corruption of every institution it touched, but something older and more difficult. Something that required, from the people at its center, not just intelligence and capability and the willingness to operate in the space where law and shadow overlapped, but the particular quality that Karain had built 23 years on and lost and rebuilt in a 6x8 cell with a flickering light, and a warden who had walked in to kill him and stayed to become something neither of them had a killer, clean word for yet. Not criminals. Not law enforcement. Not king and queen, though the city would call them that, in whispers in the months ahead. Just 2 people who had been made into instruments by the same man's ambition and had chosen separately and then together to become something else instead. The Han River caught the first pale suggestion of morning at the far edge of the sky. They walked toward it. Before we go ahead and follow this page and drop a comment below. Can Karain trust his instincts, or has surviving betrayal made him see enemies in everyone, including the one person who never lied to him? It truly means a lot to me seeing this community grow from one corner of the world to the next. Every like, every share, every new face that finds this story helps us build something worth staying for together. And if you are not following yet, do it now, because what is coming next will make everything you just read feel like the calm before the storm. The truth about Ellen's past is only half the secret. The other half has been sitting in plain sight since the first chapter, and when it lands, this entire story changes shape. See you in the next one, if they make it out of what is coming.